All right, we're in Daniel 3 this morning. This is one of those stories you're going to remember from Sunday school, if you grew up in church and Sunday school. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and if nothing else, their names you remember, right? These three guys and the fiery furnace. And if your imagination is like mine, this is one of those stories that I can run with, right? Like it just becomes vivid in my mind of what this scene would have looked like and how the whole thing plays out. And so I hope that you see it in your mind as clearly as I see it in mine as we walk through this chapter. Unfortunately, I also think this is one of those stories that often the point gets missed or misunderstood perhaps. And I hope that we can see clearly what it is God is pointing to in this chapter for us to hear this morning. Have you ever asked God for something that he didn't respond to as you hoped he would? Anybody? Nobody has. I think we all have, right? If you have prayed very many times, you have had this situation where you have come to God and you have prayed intensely. You've maybe even prayed desperately, depending on the situation. Begging God for an answer. And you'd prefer your answer if we're really honest, right? But he's silent. Or the answer is no, it's not what you had hoped it would be. I know I've done this a number of times, right? A loved one to be healed, a situation to turn out as we want it to turn out, a relationship to be healed, whatever it may be. You come to him with confidence, asking him if for something you believe is good, that you believe is even godly. You come to him in prayer thinking, of course God's going to agree with me that this is the right answer to this prayer. Yet he doesn't. And what do we do with that disappointment? And sometimes if we're really being transparent, even anger with him. God, why didn't you answer that as I wanted you to? How do those disappointments impact you the next time you need to pray? The time after. When your confidence is maybe shaken a little. Do you go and pray with the same intensity? With the same expediency of it? Do you go quickly to him or do you back off? With the same intensity, the same expectation or hope? Or is it wavering? Maybe instead of prayer, you just try to manipulate the situation. You just try to take care of it yourself. I'll bring about the result that I feel like is best. Or maybe you ask, but there's very little conviction in your ask. It's like, maybe God will answer. Or sometimes you just don't ask at all because why bother? He's not listening anyway, right? That's what we tell ourselves. At the root of our prayers is a trust in God. A trust that if we pray, if we ask, that he will respond. That he is trustworthy with our ask, whatever that is. And so then if he doesn't respond as we hoped, we can start to question his trustworthiness if we're not careful. We can start to question his character. We can start to question the relationship. Maybe we pray different. Maybe we don't pray at all. If God has failed us before in our minds, are we less likely to trust him in the future? This is at the root of our chapter today. And I'm trying to picture Daniel and his friends and the prayers they've prayed up to this point in chapter and through the first 3 chapters of Daniel. Here we have Daniel and his friends. Picture them each in their homes with their families huddled together in fear. The Babylonians have seized the city. They're sieged it. They're outside, and it's only a matter of time before they come pouring into the city, and what's going to happen then? And I picture them gathered together, crying out to God. When will it happen? What will it happen? God save us. God help us. God rescue us. And he didn't. He didn't rescue them. Daniel and his friends being chained together, healing from their emasculation, being marched for weeks across the desert to the capital of Babylon. Trying to picture their prayers as they're hot and hungry and tired and in pain. God, what is it that you're doing? Why are you doing this? Help us. rescue us, heal us, save us from this. And yet he didn't. They kept going. Or Daniel and his friends in their dormitory each night, having educational trash shoved down their throats. I'm sure praying each night, God, do we take a stand or not? God, can we do this? Should we do that? God, give us health in the midst of this test. God did answer. You remember chapter 1? He did. Or Daniel and his friends gathered together in a desperate situation in chapter 2. Their lives were on the line, praying fervently to God. God, what is this dream you gave Nebuchadnezzar? Show us. Show us not only the dream, but what it means. Father, give us favor. Save us so that we're not killed. And he came through on that one too, didn't he? See, God doesn't always answer our prayers as we want him to. And it can cause a crisis of faith. I picture these guys right here. They could be coming here into chapter 3, as we're going to see, wondering, is God going to come through today or not? And we have to ask ourselves the same question. Can I trust him with today? Can I trust him in this moment, in this season? What is it that you're asking God for? Or that he is asking you to trust him with today? That you're wavering on, that you have fear, that you have doubt? What is it that he's asking you to trust him with? That because of his past answers, you're questioning just a little bit. In chapter 3, Daniel isn't in the picture today. It's just his 3 friends. Our focus today is on them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this difficult situation they're put on, and their trust of God is going to be tested with all of these things in the background. And so let's see what they do. Chapter 3 is similar to chapter 2, and I know last week I preached in Cambridge, and so you all likely haven't heard that, which, by the way, we are having guest speakers in Oberlin occasionally, and then when I go to other campuses, all of those sermons are going to be on our YouTube page. So if you want to go see not just Jeremy's sermon from last week, but mine from last week, it's on our YouTube page, and so you'll always be able to stay up to date with all the preaching happening in our church. But last week in Cambridge, I talked about the fact that chapter 2 is what's called a chiasm. Okay, and chapter 3 is also a chiasm. Chiasms are a literary structure that authors use to draw the reader's attention to a very specific part of the story or the passage or whatever it is that they've created the chiasm out of. And this is in all kinds of different literary styles in Scripture, from poetry to history to the letters, all kinds of different places in Scripture, from Proverbs to 1 Peter to Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Ephesians 2, Ephesians 3, Colossians 1, Habakkuk, and as we'll see, at least these 2 chapters here in Daniel. And so these chiasms are designed to draw your attention to the point of the chiasm, okay? And so here we have an example, A, B, C, B, A. What happens in a chiasm is the 2 A's are similar. They're unmistakably similar. Like there's an unmistakable connection between the 2. Same with the 2 B's. There's this unmistakable connection. And then C is by itself. You can actually have 2 C's in a chiasm sometimes, but in this case, in this just generic example, there's only one. You can go further than C, by the way. I've seen all the way up to F before. But it's a way that they create symmetry in the passage, and it draws your attention to the point. So last week in chapter 2, the point of the chiasm was Daniel and his friends praying at home. That was the point of the chiasm. That was the point of the whole chapter. Everything in that chapter was drawn to bring your attention to the point of the chiasm, their prayer time in their home together. Today, chapter 3 is also a chiasm. It actually goes to part D. If we look at chapter 3, we see that the A is a decree that happens both at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter. And so we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar make 2 different decrees. And then the second is B, and this is an accusation. At the beginning of the chapter, there's an accusation made against the 3, and at the end, there's a rescuing or a vindication from the accusation. So this closure to the application or the accusation at the end. And C then is a threat of punishment and then the actual punishment. And it points us all to D, which is the focus of the whole chapter. And that is what I've called unyielding trust. But it's this moment of decision for the guys. Will they or will they not trust God? Okay, and spoiler alert by the title, they do. Unyielding trust. But that is the point of the whole chapter. Everything in the chapter serves that purpose of their trust, their unyielding trust of God. And so as we read through it, let's make note of this so we know our focus is going where it's supposed to go. Chapter 2 was paired with chapter 7. Chapter 3 today is paired with chapter 6. And as you'll see next week, 4 is paired with 5. You see these pairs going through the book of Daniel. So let's jump into chapter 3, verse 1, and let's start with the decree and go on through the chapter here. So King Nebuchadnezzar had a golden statue made. It was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. He erected it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent out a summons to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other authorities of the province to attend the dedication of the statue that he had erected. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and the other provincial authorities assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had erected. They were standing in front of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had erected. Now, I want you to think about the size of the statue. We're giving nothing in description of it except height and width and gold. The thing is huge. Picture the amount of egotism it takes for somebody to build a statue like this for themselves, for the worship of themselves, because that's essentially what Nebuchadnezzar has done here. He's created this statue and he's called all these people to come and to bow down and give their allegiance and worship him. Now, there's something interesting in this whole chapter, but we've seen it 3 times already. There's this term, this word, and in your translation it may be slightly different, but in mine it's the term erected. It may be to set up in yours, but it's a term being used that's used numerous times throughout this chapter. And its purpose is very clear, that it's always pointing back to Nebuchadnezzar as the one who erected or set up the statue. You see it in verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 3 already. That very clearly the author is pointing to Nebuchadnezzar as being he himself the one who set up the monument for himself. It's pointing to his arrogance. Last week we talked about that worldly kingdoms are built by worldly hands and God's kingdom is built by God's hands, not by human hands. Nebuchadnezzar is flying straight in the face of this. Nebuchadnezzar is building all this and then pointing to himself as the one with the credit. That he, come worship me through this statue is what he's saying. That he is placing himself in a position he should not be in. And there's even more kind of gall in this. In chapter 2, the dream that he had, the head represented him and it was gold, remember? Now the whole thing is gold. It's like Nebuchadnezzar is giving God the burden saying, you think just a golden head was enough? The whole thing needs to be gold. The whole thing is about me. The whole thing is about him and his arrogance, showing very little respect for God, very little respect for authority. He is so pretentious, believing he is above God and stronger than God. And we're just going to see it drip out in the rest of this first part of this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar had recently squashed a rebellion, and so this statue wasn't just an assault on God, it was a political tool. It was a tool he was using to say, I'm going to make all these folks come and bow down to me, and we're going to find who's actually loyal to me. We're going to assert my authority in this place, and we're going to figure this out. So he would not have been in a temperament for treason or insubordination or pushing back on the status quo. He is in a position, having just squashed this rebellion, that people better come and they better bow to my statue, because this whole thing is about me, right? It's very much his posture. It's worth saying that there's this whole list of people called here. Back in Israel, the land of Judah, is this man named Zedekiah. He actually was Jewish, but was what was called a vassal ruler, meaning King Nebuchadnezzar, when he sieged it and took it over, took a Jewish man and raised him up to the seat of leader of that area. And but really, he was just a puppet. He had really no authority other than what Nebuchadnezzar and his folks gave him, but that's how part of how he managed and ruled the different areas he had conquered. And there is actually non-biblical historic reference that Zedekiah went to Babylon about this time. I wonder why he was going there. Probably because of this event. Let's keep going, verse 4. And then the herald made a loud proclamation. To you, O people, nations, and language groups, the following command is given. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, and the zither, the trigon, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music, you must bow down and pay homage to the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has erected. There's our word. Whoever does not bow down and pay homage will immediately be thrown in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, when they all heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, trigon, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and language groups began to bow down, paying homage to the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had erected. There's our word again. You notice the precision of this chapter, how the lists are repeated over and over and over again? I don't know why. I think it states something about the control that was had in that place. But right on cue, the music plays and the people bow down. I wonder if Zedekiah did. I would guess he probably did. Verse 8, now at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought malicious accusations against the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever, butter him up. You have issued an edict, O God, or O king, that everyone must bow down and pay homage to the golden statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the trigon, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music. And whoever does not bow down and pay homage will be thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. But there are Jewish men whom you appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have not shown proper respect to you, O king. They don't serve your gods, and they don't pay homage to the golden statue that you erected. This is our accusation. To worship an image is to worship the thing the image is in. In this case, Nebuchadnezzar. He was wanting them to come and bow down and worship him as king. If they had bowed down to the statue, they would have been worshiping an idol. Clearly went against their faith, worshiping a false god as such. And if, in fact, they did not bow down, if that is what they did, that they did not bow and did not worship him, then they were committing insubordination. Not just politically, but religiously, and not worshiping Nebuchadnezzar and his gods as he expected them to. Some have asked at this point, where's Daniel? Wasn't he supposed to be here and part of this whole deal too? And no one really knows the answer, but if you notice at the end of chapter 2, verse 49, when they are promoted at the end of that chapter, they're promoted to different positions, Daniel and then the three guys. And it's assumed, I guess, that Daniel in his position, because this whole scene of chapter 3 is happening in a particular part of Babylon, that maybe Daniel and his job was not included in the invitation like the other three were, but we really don't know. But Daniel is nowhere to be found in this whole story. But here these guys are. They have now been accused of not bowing down to the statue as was commanded of them. So verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in a fit of rage, demanded that they bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him. They brought them before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods, and that you don't pay homage to the golden statue that, here it is, I erected? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, trigon, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must bow down and pay homage to the statue that I made, I erected. There it is. If you don't pay homage to it, you will immediately be thrown in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And this last key sentence is important. Now, who is that God who can rescue you from my power? Whew. Nebuchadnezzar is nice enough to give him a second chance. Well, he's doubling down on the threat, but he ends with a very brazen statement. Who is this God who can rescue you from me and my power? Nebuchadnezzar is placing himself on par or above whomever this God is that these guys worship. He is challenging God. He's placing himself on the seat of God, even above God. These are fighting words with God. He's arrogant enough to believe the human perspective of the first 3 chapters. He believes he's actually won, that he beat God in chapter 1. He believes that God is weak and helpless and his power is greater. He hasn't read chapter 1 like we have to know that he didn't actually win. God gave him a gift of victory. He's interpreting God's silence as weakness, which of course is not true, and he's going to find that out the hard way here soon enough. Unfortunately, when you mix ignorance and arrogance together, you have a really bad combination. But many of us have that same combination. We can struggle with it. We overestimate our wisdom. We overestimate our brain power, our understanding of the world. We underestimate our power, our control. We like to control things, and we think we're actually in control, all the while underestimating his wisdom and his power and his control. We think we're self-made men. We think we've earned something for ourselves. We want credit for this or that. We think our smarts and our experience has earned us this. We think that we are equally equipped, maybe even better equipped than God to run the world, so we don't seek him out. We don't go seek his favor. We don't seek his input. We don't go pray. We just do, thinking we got it covered. None of us would ever make the statement that Nebuchadnezzar made there in that last verse, but yet we kind of do when we say, never mind, God, I have it. We feel like we got it covered. We've come to the point of the chiasm now. What are the guys going to do? They've been commanded to bow down to this statue. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to King Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to give you a reply concerning this. If our God, whom we are serving, exists, he is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us, O God, from your power as well. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we don't serve your gods, and we will not pay homage to your golden statue that you have erected." They have unyielding trust. Their statement is crystal clear. That first sentence feels arrogant to us, feels prideful and disrespectful, but it's not. It's a statement of fact. It's saying, Nebuchadnezzar, you know that we're guilty. We know that we're guilty. Why waste time talking about it? The fact of the matter is, we're guilty. We did not bow down. Verses 17 and 18 are both powerful but also difficult. In the Aramaic language, there's some wordage used here that's not as clear as we would like it to be. But from what I found, the kind of most literal translation that we could find of that passage says this: "If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, then let him deliver us. But if not, let it be known we will not bow down to your statue." That there is this element of unknown, this element of doubt. If our God is able, if he is able, he will deliver us. But if he is not, we're still not bowing down. There's a touch of doubt. There's a touch of uncertainty that we don't know. Sometimes in the past, he said yes. Sometimes in the past, he said no. We don't know on this one. But what is clear is we are not bowing down. Now, we can criticize them for their doubt if we'd like. I think we ought to keep a few things in mind. The first is, these are teenage boys. These are not like super mature, older Christian people that have walked with God a very long time in their lives. These are teenagers. All of this is remarkable when you think about them in their age. This whole story. Second one is remember your doubts and fears. Put yourself in their shoes. The third is, I think, actually really important, and I think actually makes the whole situation much more impressive, and that their doubt actually makes their faith more impressive, their trust. Because think about something. If you were in a situation where you had to ask, like, do you trust that if I drop this object, it's going to fall to the ground? And you're like, yes, I trust that if I drop it, it's going to fall, right? Is there any uncertainty about that? Almost none, right? Like, yes, obviously something miraculous could happen and it could not fall, but we know that if we drop something, it's going to fall. In their situation, there is no certainty. When we are placed in situations where there is no certainty, that's where true trust and true faith comes through. Because if there's certainty, why do you need trust? It's certain. Here are the boys, they don't know. They don't know. God has come through at certain times. God hasn't come through at certain times. They don't know. But they are acting in trust. And I want to be really clear on this, and I think this is where some children's curriculums and how we tell the story with kids misses the point. The point of the passage isn't that if you stand up for your faith, God will rescue you. That isn't the point. The point of the passage is, do we trust God? Do we trust him? That's the point of the chiasm. These decisions of trust. Because the fact of the matter is, there have been millions of disciples of Jesus over the years who have trusted him and have been killed for their faith. This idea that the point of the story is that God will rescue if you trust him is just false. It's not true. He may not. We don't know. We have no record that at least I know of and can find of any other time in human history when Christians were put into a fiery furnace and rescued. That's not the point of the passage. The point of the chapter is our trust of him. We don't have to be sure, 100% confident of God's ability or willingness to answer our prayer, to trust him. Trust is a choice. We choose to trust him or not. There are no guarantees. We have no idea what the outcomes will be. There is no equation of A plus B equals God rescues. That's not how it works. We trust God because of his character. Because we believe that even if he disagrees with us, that he knows best. In his wisdom and his sovereignty, he knows best. And that because of who he is, his character, he is trustworthy. If yesterday I prayed and the answer was no, today I get the chance to trust him again, to re-up my faith a second time. Even if he has said no every single time before, today I get the chance of trusting him again. Trust is a choice, and it's what faith is. Often, that choice will fly in the face of our culture. I had that conversation this week with one of our kids. The right thing was not how it works at school. It's like, you're right. It doesn't change that it's the right thing. And do you trust him enough to do what's right? It's going to go against our culture. It's often going to be uncomfortable because it goes against the culture. It's going to be something that when we trust him, it's going to be something that gets us out of our comfort zone and puts us against the flow of the culture. And so it's going to be uncomfortable to trust him. And sometimes it's even going to feel flat illogical to us. Of course, if we get thrown in the fiery furnace, we're going to burn up. It might be completely illogical. But if we are clear that he is speaking to us, that we hear him, that we know his heart, that we are confident of what he is calling us to do, then we can trust him. And we can trust him anyway. Our faith is grown, by the way. Our trust of him grows over time. You're not popping out some faith-trusting superhero. It's built day in and day out, small decision after small decision. These tiny little things that we trust him with. We take the risk of trusting him in that, and then we get to trust him again and again and again. And over time, it should build. As we trust him, our trust of him will grow to bigger and bigger things. I guarantee you, if you go from not trusting him at all to being in these guys' shoes, you're not going to trust him. Trust is built as we trust him, and he proves himself trustworthy. Every one of us get these twinges of fear, of doubt, of uncertainty. Do we trust anyway? Do we trust him enough to say, yes, I fear, yes, I doubt, yes, this is uncertain, but God, I know your voice, I know your call, I'm taking this step in trust of you, knowing no outcome. No guarantee of the outcome. Maybe God will, maybe God won't. But for these three guys, they're unequivocally trusting him, and they will not bow to his stupid statue, even if it means the fiery furnace. So verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and his disposition changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times hotter than it was normally heated. He ordered strong soldiers in his army to tie Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So those men were tied up while still wearing their cloaks, their trousers, turbans, and other clothes. They were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. But the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so excessively hot, the men who escorted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were killed by the leaping flames. But those 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the furnace of blazing fire, still securely bound. This is exactly what we're all scared of, isn't it? The consequences of our faith. Being faithful and trusting him sounds great until we think of the consequences. What if? What if I do and they do? What if I... And that's exactly what we're scared of. The consequences are not guaranteed of our faith. Here, the guys were promised, they were warned. They weren't surprised, I'm sure. It's easy for us to say, oh yeah, I trust God. But then when the possibility of the consequences runs through our minds, we're like, whoa. Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't trust God. Nebuchadnezzar, his face showed his anger towards them. I picture just steam shooting out his ears, right? His beet red, just angry. How dare you guys do this? They were seized, they were bound, no time was wasted. Kill them now, throw them in, make it 7 times hotter. Not that we're measuring, just make it so hot that it's perfectly hot. They usually built the furnaces into a hillside so you could be thrown in from the top. The soldiers grab them, tie them up, go to throw them in. The contrast is interesting. It stated that even the soldiers who were taking them were killed by the flames, that it was so hot, the inferno was raging so much that it consumed them too. And here are these 3 going into the fire. Now, if you don't know the rest of the story, there's some things to wrestle with here. These guys were faithful. Why'd you allow this, God? Did he not listen again? Is this more reason to question him and his trustworthiness? Verse 24. King Nebuchadnezzar was startled and quickly got up. He said to his ministers, wasn't it 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied to the king, for sure, O king. He answered, but I see 4 men, untied and walking around in the midst of the fire. No harm has come to them. And the appearance of the 4th is like that of a god. Then Nebuchadnezzar approached the door to the furnace of the blazing fire and called out, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. That's an interesting statement. Come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerged from the fire. Once the satraps, prefects, governors, and ministers of the king had gathered around, he saw that those men were physically unharmed by the fire. The hair of their heads was not singed, nor were their trousers damaged. Not even the smell of fire was to be found on them. They've been vindicated. They've been rescued. Something startled Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know how many times he had done this before, but this one wasn't like the others. Something was different. They're fine when they shouldn't be, and that contrast with the soldiers is clear. But then there's this fourth person. It says this fourth person looks like a god. It doesn't say it is God. It says it looks like a god. Whether it's an angel or a theophany, meaning an appearance of Jesus prior to his incarnation, we don't know. But either way, this is a God-like figure inside. The point is clear. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. God didn't keep them from the fire. He went with them in it. The fire had no impact on them at all. And if you've ever been around fires, you know that that is impossible. Their clothes were fine. Their hair was fine. And we all know how easily you can smell like smoke just being near a barbecue, right? It didn't even smell like it. God didn't keep them from it. He didn't rescue them from it. He went into the fire with them. And in this case, he protected them from it. Now we come back to our last A. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed in verse 28, Praise be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent forth his angel and has rescued his servants, and this is key, who trusted in him. Even Nebuchadnezzar knows what's happened. Ignoring the edict of the king and giving up their bodies rather than serve or pay homage to any other god than their God. That's quite the statement if you think about it. I hereby decree that any people, nations, or language group that blasphemes the God of Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego will be dismembered and his home reduced to rubble. He's getting better. For there exists no other God who can deliver in this way. Then Nebuchadnezzar promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the province of Babylon. It was a miracle of God. He worked a miracle by going into the fire and saving them in the midst of it. You know, I wonder, did these three guys ever struggle again to trust God? Were there ever twinges of doubt and uncertainty again? Of course there was. Of course there was. I'm positive. Because just like you and I, God blesses us, God comes through, God rescues us, God provides for us, God does all kinds of stuff for us, and we still question him. Why wouldn't they? This wasn't like a cure-all for doubt. God shows up in our lives all the time, and yet we still have these sort of fears and doubts and questions and don't always trust him well. Remember the question from earlier that we started with. What's God asking you to trust him with? But maybe you're hesitant because of the past. I wonder, has he shown himself trustworthy to you? It can be hard knowing that sometimes he answers and sometimes he doesn't, right? But has he proven himself trustworthy to you? Do you know his voice well enough to be confident in what he is calling you to do and the wisdom that is his? Do you know him well enough? Have you walked with him long enough to know that, to discern that difference? Are there things you fear that are bigger than him, or are they smaller than him? Are you reducing who he is, his abilities, his power, to a place they shouldn't be? What is God asking you to trust him with today? Is it a decision, a relationship, a situation, a person? Remember, he might tell you no again. Doesn't mean you don't trust him. If he is trustworthy, then trust him. Make that decision. And we must remember that we trust every day. We get that decision to trust every day. And here, our series and our book is about being faithful in exile. And often in exile, the stakes are high, like fiery furnace high. You won't be faithful. You won't trust him in those times when the heat is turned up if you're not being faithful when the heat is low. That's where our faith is grown. That's where our faith is built. I would argue that if you're not going to trust him with the small things, you're not going to trust him with the big things when they come along. James tells us in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, he says this, "My brothers and sisters, consider it but joy when you fall into all sorts of trials." That's persecution, by the way. Consider it joy when you fall into persecution, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you will be perfect and complete, not deficient in anything. James is saying that we should consider persecution. We should consider the heat of the furnace, the tests of our faith, to be a blessing, because they produce endurance of our faith, which makes us mature. If you're not willing to trust God, if you're not willing to step into the furnace, you will not mature. Peter says something similar in 2 Peter 4. He says, "Dear friends, do not be astonished that a trial by fire is occurring." We shouldn't be surprised. We're not citizens of this world, right? We shouldn't be surprised that there's trials, that there's persecutions, that we're getting pushed upon and our faith is being tested. We shouldn't be surprised. As though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice in the degree that you have shared in the sufferings of Christ. That just as he suffered for us, we get to suffer for our faith. So that when his glory is revealed, you may also rejoice and be glad. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. We don't consider this blessing at all, do we? It says that you're blessed. So the Spirit of glory, who is the Spirit of God, rests upon you. That's really beautiful to hear and hard to do. Our challenge from chapter 3 is, what is God asking you to trust him with today? And are you going to trust him with it? It's that simple. We're going to end by taking communion. Communion is designed as this anchor point for us, this reminder of what God has done for us, so that we have this anchor place to come back to. So that as we're navigating life and asking, do we trust him or not, we come back to things such as this to anchor our faith. So gentlemen, would you bring the elements forward? As they do, I want to remind you that at our church, you don't have to be a member here to take communion. You would just have to claim Jesus as your Lord and Savior. You would have to have made that commitment of faith to him. As they pass them out, there will be two cups stacked on top of each other, the bread underneath, the juice on top. There's gluten-free options then also in the centers as well. So go ahead and pass them out, guys. Oh, yes, thank you. As they pass them, I would encourage you to wrestle with that question. God, what is it that I need to trust you with today? And maybe I'm hesitant to. And allow these elements you're holding to help guide that conversation.